It's time to modulate the hell out of your sound creations. MSoundFactory features two separate modulation systems. First, there are the classic melder modulators. We call that the global modulation system. That's because it affects all voices at once, similar to the Effects tab. These modulators are extremely powerful and can be attached to nearly any parameter in MSoundFactory. But interestingly, these are not the ones you are likely to use in most cases, unless you are modulating effects. There is an entire video tutorial series about them. See below. So let's talk about the other modulation system, the per voice modulation, and the name says it all. Logically, this doesn't even exist in the FX tab. So let's focus on the Generator tab. Let me insert an oscillator. Notice the buttons on the left of some parameters. These are the modulation buttons. The parameters featuring them are called modulation targets. And in the bottom of the window, there is a per voice modulation sources panel. So let me drag and drop the LFO1 from its arrow into the semitones parameter modulation button. It is green now, and when I play a note, the green part shows the actual value, and you can easily hear what is happening. So let's click it. Every parameter with per voice modulation in MSoundFactory has its own modulation matrix. There, you can put up to 16 modulation sources and combine them in various ways. You can see the LFO1 in the row A. Click on it to view other modulation sources. Well, there are many of them. But first, how much are we modulating? Under the LFO, there's the modulation depth, which says 100%, but we don't seem to be modulating too much. There's the global modulation depth on top, and that one is 20% by default. Notice how changing it also changes the modulation button itself. And yes, you can access this directly from the button. You can also disable the modulation entirely by right-clicking or holding Control or Command on Mac and clicking on the modulation button. Or you can use the Enable button in the title of the modulation settings. Let me drag and drop envelope 1 onto the same modulation button. Row B got activated. The parameter is now modulated by both LFO1 and envelope 1. And how? Imagine each modulation source produces a signal from -1 to +1. And to get the final modulation value, all rows are summed. So we get LFO1 plus envelope 1. To make things more obvious, I'll click on the envelope button to get the envelope settings, and I'll increase the attack to, say, 5 seconds. Now, let me play a note and watch the indication. Blue for each modulation source, red for each row, and green for the final modulation. Let me lower the depth of the LFO1 to see what happens. The envelope has the same impact as before, but LFO does not. Now I will remove the envelope from row B and add it to the same row the LFO is on. Click the empty button, marked off for now, and select envelope 1. Let me play a note. Now they are combined in quite a different way. See the little button between them saying mul? That's because these are multiplied. In simple terms, the value of the parameter is increased only if both modulation sources are high. Since the envelope is initially 0 and slowly rising, initially the LFO doesn't have much effect and goes stronger with the envelope. In even simpler terms, envelope controls the strength of the LFO and vice versa. You can click on the button to select a different operation, but in most cases, multiplication is what you want. If I add yet another modulation source on the third item on row A, all three will be multiplied together, and so on. Time to check the tiny buttons in each modulation source. First, there's the pop-up button, which displays source settings. Here, I can easily access the settings of the envelope, for example. Not all sources have settings though. Next button inverts the polarity of the source. Let me show you what happens if I invert the envelope. Finally, each source has a free-form transformation, so you can change its shape if you wish. For now, the modulation was always increasing the pitch, but what if we want to modulate it both ways, up and down, around the center value? Simple. Enable the up and down switch for the row. Different rows can then work differently again. There are a few more things on top of the modulation settings. First, there's the analog drift. There's a cool controllable system in MSoundFactory to make it behave like an analog synth. In analog devices, nothing is accurate and everything is moving all the time, even if just a little bit. And that's what the analog drift feature simulates. All you need is to go to the Globals tab and enable the analog panel. It contains a few parameters controlling the drift behavior, but mainly every modulatable parameter has this analog drift parameter, which controls how much this applies to it. Each module automatically sets the defaults, so in most cases there's nothing to do really, and everything just works. But sometimes you may want to control how much the analog drift applies to a particular parameter, and that's what the analog drift control is for. A single value, that's all it takes. Note that the modulation certainly requires some CPU, so at the end, the whole analog drift feature takes quite some resources. Next, the circular switch. Normally the modulation goes up and or down, and it cannot exceed the parameter range, of course. But in some specific cases, you want it to jump from maximum to minimum, and vice versa. For example, imagine a wavetable, where the first and last waves are sines. If you modulate the selected wave and reach the maximum, it's sine, but the minimum is also sine, so you may continue the modulation upwards from the minimum. And that's what the circular feature does. Not something you'd need every day, but still. And finally, the transformation. While every source has its own transformation, the output can be transformed again. Finally, the title has some handy features, such as presets as usual. It can even generate random modulation. And there's a map of all per-voice modulations in current settings. In the next tutorial, we'll go over the available per-voice modulation sources.